It should be a very good time to be discussing economics, development, people's welfare, livelihoods on the continent right now. As the moderator referred to earlier on, we are going through an era where there is a dominant narrative around Africa rising. And these are just some of the headlines from some of your most prominent publications who are talking about this Africa rising. So you see The Economist, they're the ones who initiated or coined that Africa rising term. And then Time picked up on it, and they even doubled up with 2 covers dedicated to the Africa rising story. So we must be feeling really good as Africans to be living through these times when there is this kind of narrative going on. What's interesting, though, is that if you look at the levels of social protests across the continent, my dear comrade Patrick Bond calls it Africa Uprising. This is basically a plot from Agence France-Presse reports on social protest across the continent. And you can actually see that there is a huge contradiction in the sense that the period that is coined as the Africa Rising period also coincides with the period of rising social protest. In fact, they are rising really astronomically. If you look at what happens from around 2008 into 2009 up to now, we are seeing a period of increased social protests, most of them around social service delivery questions, which basically means these are protests around people's livelihoods. And if we look at this whole decade, which has been termed the Africa Rising decade, the real indicator that economists, as brilliant as they tell us they are, looked at is the question of rising GDP. And that rising GDP across the continent was a GDP that was driven by the rise in commodity prices. So we are kind of going through a very funny dance where right now, because over the last year you've started to see the collapse of those commodity prices, some people are beginning to want to talk of an Africa sinking. And I think part of the conversation that is beginning to come in is what are the measures that we are looking at when we coin terms like rising or going down, but also how are the people on the ground responding to these issues. So this fits into the broader contradiction or paradox, if you want, around Africa being a continent that is resource rich, but at the same time that has the worst human development indicators of any other continent in this world. We are not just resource rich, but our levels of exploiting those resources and trading in those resources has actually been increasing. If we had enough time, we can go deeper into this Africa rising narrative and plot the graphs, and you see that what has been rising the most is actually corporate profit levels, and even the level of that profit that has been repatriated overseas. So we have this huge contradiction. We are resource wealth, but our people are poor, and they are getting impatient because they are protesting and rising up against very poor living standards.